All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a new year of the Go On webinar series. My name is Gabby Kitch. I'm an International Policy Fellow with NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. This webinar series has 4 organizing sponsors. First, GOA ON, the Global Ocean Acidification Observing Network. Second, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Third, the IAEA OAICC, the International Atomic Energy Agency Ocean Acidification International Coordination Center. And lastly, IOC UNESCO, the Intergovernmental Oceanic Commission of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. For those of you who are new to GOA ON, it is a collaborative international network designed to detect and understand the drivers of ocean acidification and the resulting impacts on marine ecosystems. GOA ON serves as a platform for more than 900 scientists to acquire and exchange data and knowledge necessary to optimize modeling results. And GOA ON provides key input to communities, industry, government, and global organizations seeking to develop action plans, best practices, and mitigation adaptation strategies to address ocean acidification impacts. During this presentation, all the participants are in listen-only mode. You are welcome to type any questions into the questions box, which is on the bottom control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. I'll be monitoring these incoming questions and will pose them to the speakers during our question and answer session, which will be immediately following the last presentation. So now to introduce our speakers. Firstly, Dr. Sarah Cooley, who's the Director of Climate Science at the Ocean Conservancy in Washington, D.C. She was a coordinating lead author on the Oceans and Coastal Systems of the Working Group 2, the IPCC's 6th assessment report. Dr. Helen Gurney-Smith is a research scientist for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada. She was the lead author for the IPCC Working Group 2, 6th assessment report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability on the food, fiber, and other ecosystem products chapter, and moving plate cross-chapter box, and a contributing author on the Oceans and Coastal Systems chapter. Lastly, Dr. Libby Jewett is the director of NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program. She was also a lead author on the North American Regional Chapter of the IPCC AR6 Working Group 2 Impact and Adaptation Report. Thank you all to the speakers for being here today, and I know we're all really excited to hear more about ocean acidification and the IPCC report. So with that, I will hand it over to Sarah, and please pose any questions you may have for the speakers in the questions box.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks, Abby, for having us and organizing us. So today I'll be starting out and I'll talk a little bit about the IPCC in general, just to acquaint you, and then I'll talk about the ocean-focused results. Then Helen will take over and talk a little bit more about how acidification enters into the IPCC findings on the area of her expertise that she worked on, so like the food and natural resources. And then Libby's going to be talking about particularly geographically tied case studies. Next slide, please. So the IPCC has been around for quite a long time. We've had the IPCC convened jointly by WMO and UNEP starting in 1988. That actually predated the UNFCCC, which is interesting because the IPCC is the primary sort of scientific input to the UNFCCC. Since those days, the information around the science of climate change has grown exponentially. There's been a growing public awareness and a growing interest to include climate science into policy. And so this timeline just gives you a flavor of how that has really taken root. And you're seeing almost an exponential, or a real growing in rate and frequency of publications to inform our work globally on climate change. Next slide, please. So Working Group 2 is the second in a series of reports, which will be sort of bookended by the synthesis report coming out later this year. And in Group 2, we're really charged with looking at the impacts of climate change on natural systems and all the adaptation portfolio. So I'll talk a little bit about impact and adaptation in a general way, and then the other two speakers will be more specific. So I'll be focusing greatly on Chapter 3. I'll be touching a little bit on what came in Working Group 1, which was the physical science of climate change, and I'll flag when those are Working Group 1 results. And then Helen will be picking up on Chapter 5. Next slide, please. So this figure provides a conceptual outline showing how physical drivers, heat and carbon dioxide on the left of the screen really affect the ocean and coastal systems all the way through to human dependencies and human behaviors. And this figure organizing schematic that represents Chapter 3 of the second assessment report, but it applies to our talk as well. So I'll start and talk about the things, physical systems to the organisms and population scale things. Helen will talk about ecosystem services and human communities, and Libby's going to talk about those regional details. Next slide, please. Group 1, these are Working Group 1 results, and they assess that it's virtually certain that seawater pH has declined globally over the last 40 years, and human influence is the main driver of observed acidification. And they were virtually certain about that too. Strong words coming from a pretty conservative body. Acidification and oxygen loss are also co-occurring in most places. Working Group 1 assessed there's high confidence that oxygen levels have dropped in many regions since the mid-20th century, and the geographic range of many marine organisms has changed over the last 2 decades. They also projected, looking into the future, that stratification, which is virtually certain, acidification, virtually certain, deoxygenation, high confidence, and marine heat wave frequency are going to continue to increase in the 21st century. And it's worth noting at this point that the confidence language, the certainty, the confidence language is calibrated to mathematics. And if you're curious to learn more about that, it's explained in all of the IPCC reports. I invite you to take a look at that. It really gives you a greater sense of just what the evidence behind these statements is like. But you should know that a virtually certain really means that, this is, there's all kinds of evidence pointing to it. The evidence is consistent, the evidence is high quality, and there's a lot of different types of evidence. And so that's what these high confidence and highly certain results correspond to. Something where there's evidence, it's all in agreement, and it comes from a lot of different sources. So we have really good confidence that it's not just an artifact of how we're learning about it. Next slide, please. So there's also very high confidence that present day surface pH values are unprecedented for at least 26,000 years, and the current range are unprecedented since then. So over the last 2 or 3 decades, there's been a pH decline in the ocean interior as well. This figure shows that. It shows the long-term change of annual and zonal ocean pH. This shows multi-model results looking at the changes in it's basically the change in the end of century relative to the present day mean, so 1995 to 2014, for both SSP1 2.6 and SSP3 7.0. And these SSPs are really the future emissions. So the low numbered SSPs are low emission scenarios. Things like SSP3 are sort of middle of the road emission scenarios, and things like, I forget which one is most common, we'll counter it in a second, but the higher SSP numbers are the the highest emission scenarios. And those do correspond to what we used to use, which is the representative concentration pathways, the RCP numbers you might be more familiar with. So this figure really shows exactly how ocean acidification is developing in the interior. And you can see with the lower emission scenario on the left, we're seeing a lot less change over time in the ocean interior. And then on the right, you're seeing a lot more at the surface and a bit more in the ocean interior. In these projections, they really found that projected surface acidification extent and patterns, and also the interior ocean acidification patterns, are really determined by the pathway of atmospheric CO2 rise. So whatever our emissions trajectory is really governs how acidification will manifest in the ocean. And all of this stuff is in great detail in Working Group 1. Next slide, please. So this is switching over to Working Group 2, where we think a little bit more about how pH is changing simultaneously with other ocean features, results from those physical system changes that were assessed in Working Group 1. This figure looks at different future projections would yield specific temperature, nutrient, pH, and oxygen outcomes in the surface ocean. And this figure actually provides that relationship of the previously used RCP scenarios to the SSP scenarios. So the RCP of 8.5 that we're all used to thinking about as like high emission scenario corresponds to what is being called SSP 5 8.5 in this new report. So you can see with the miniatures on the right that as the emission scenarios have higher and higher emissions, so E through H, we're also seeing that the changes in the surface ocean are more and more extensive. So we know that the projections under the lowest scenario, so SSP 1, 2.6, really give us a surface pH decline of 0.16 pH units from pre-industrial to end of century. And then it's actually 0.4 pH units from pre-industrial to end of century. And so that's sort of global average. The mean open ocean has already declined. I guess that's on a different slide, sorry. But so the mean open oceans declined by about 0.08 pH units under the lower emissions scenario. We're looking at much higher, like 0.3 pH units. So it's really like our emissions trajectory has everything to do with how acidification will unfold in the oceans. And then in addition, the subsurface pH story is also going to be adjusted not only by rate of CO2 emission, changes in ocean circulation, so changes in ocean overturning, movement of water masses, and then how organic matter is remineralized through the water column. And all of those things are expected to change somewhat because of climate change. Next slide, please. So the temperature and CO2 uptake effects are affecting ocean pH, the recycling and movement of nutrients in the ocean, and this is affecting entire ecosystems. So this figure is pretty complex, but I like it because it highlights particular ocean systems next to each other, and it really traces what the biogeochemical story is for each of these ecosystems in the near, mid, and long-term periods under 3 different emission scenarios. So in our chapter, we also look at this for different depth environments. So I encourage you to take a peek at that if you're interested in what happens in the ocean interior. So Working Group 1 really confirmed a lot of these, these mass changes that we're expecting to see and how they will unfold related to emission scenario. And in the Working Group 2, we really got thinking about how it's much harder to detect and attribute acidification, especially in coastal zones, because there's so much more spatial and temporal variability. And there's also a lot of influence of other natural acidification drivers. And this is something that we know from working in the coastal zone. But because the observing network in the coastal ocean has expanded so much in the last years, we are having a much greater understanding of how these systems are becoming acidified. It still looks though that it's going to be about 2 more decades of observations are going to be required before that anthropogenic acidification signal is apparent over the natural variability in some coastal sites. So definitely more observations are continued to be needed. That observing network that continues to grow will keep giving us a better sense of what actually we're seeing that is out of the norm in those coastal zones. Next slide, please. So the next thing our chapter worked on was really looking at how acidification and other drivers affect organism physiology. So these are provisional pre-final figures. So sometimes we have watermarks. But panel A is a really good reminder of how physiological processes vary in rate based on the influence of different drivers. The classical example shown here is temperature. There's an optimal temperature window where all physiological processes can operate, and there are critical temperatures above and below those spaces where a stress response would occur. And panel B shows the same idea in 2 dimensions. So we've imposed 2 different drivers with 2 different performance curves, and this gives you a two-dimensional surface describing the physiological rate changes. And so panel 3 is where it gets a little harder to imagine, from the surface to the outcome. But really, the idea of panel 3 is to show that these drivers can have additive, synergistic, or antagonistic effects on physiological processes. And this affects overall outcomes. So, for example, higher carbon dioxide concentrations can increase and growth in some species, whereas lower pH levels can decrease calcification in other species. At the same time, we're having temperature changes, major driver on these processes. And so overall, the outcome is going to vary by process, by species, and going to affect how that population responds. We know that there's detrimental impacts of acidification, especially on early life stages, but it gets a lot more complex when we're talking about more complex organisms. So for finfish, or for higher organisms, we're starting to see these behavioral and sensory consequences in laboratory, but they're not necessarily consistent with all taxa or all species or even all strains, and that makes it quite hard and fast lessons about how populations will respond. But we are starting to have some insights. Next slide, please. So this is a schematic showing how each trophic level in an ecosystem is experiencing a different mix of drivers that matter to it. And this sort of patchwork or heterogeneity in what drivers matter to which elements of the ecosystem gives you a sense of just how complex it is to anticipate what the outcomes will be for each guild in an ecosystem, or as a population, and as an ecosystem as a whole. But we do see some trends emerging. So we have warming and rising dioxide concentrations that are enhancing growth or photosynthetic rates in many species. We have warming and ocean acidification that appear to jointly favor proliferation and toxicity of harmful algal blooms. However, the effect, on the species, I should say, but the effect on blooms is still unresolved, because we have a question about whether the results we're seeing are related to more intense monitoring, or whether it's actually attributable to climate change. And that's still someplace where the science is advancing. There are other taxa that are showing different sensitivity to temperature and acidification based on changes in irradiance or nutrient supply or food supply. So those are some complex findings that are emerging as well. But in general, we see one or two drivers are generally dominating the cumulative outcome, and then other drivers play a subordinate role. So acidification and hypoxia are also known to contribute to a decrease or shift in thermal tolerance. So that's another instance of how these drivers can interact in very complex ways. We're seeing warming and hypoxia mostly causing avoidance behavior that potentially leads to migration and habitat compression. But the effects of acidification are more complex. We're seeing changes in physiological signaling, brain chemistry, learning, and this affects learning, escape behavior, olfaction, even affect metabolic processes in a variety of ways. So it's really difficult to generalize what extent acidification or warming will worsen or ameliorate. Next slide. Of emerging on the role of climate drivers as evolutionary pressures. Showing how climate drivers can decrease population fitness or increase extinction risk. So in one case on the left, population experiences this low stress new environment. It's able to acclimate. It undergoes selection for acclimated individuals across many generations, and the population is maintained. In the other situation down the right, a population experiences a really high stress new it exhibits this stress response, which is detrimental to the individuals, and selection across generations happens, and then population size and fitness decrease. So evolutionary and plasticity studies are really at the stage of being able to identify acclimation ability or plasticity individuals to acidification and warming, especially in invertebrates and seaweeds and fish. A smaller number of studies are looking at across generation studies, especially with invertebrates and microbes that have really fast generation times. And then, as you can imagine, ecosystem models are becoming increasingly useful to examine how acidification and warming and other jointly occurring drivers will affect the populations and the ecosystem overall on multi-generational scales within marine ecosystems, but they're absolutely still a developing field. Next slide, please. One of the most common ways to get snapshots of the way biological changes are happening in the ocean is looking at species richness or species migration. So species richness is this snapshot of what species are in place at a particular time. And this results both from ecosystem structure as well as migration into or out of a region. So this figure shows how species richness has changed recently and how it's projected to change in the future under moderate and high emission scenarios. So on the left, you see this two-hump distribution in the mid-latitudes, and that's going to be decent. On the right, it's actually projected percent change. So negative score on that right side is actually that hump shape and decrease the species richness in the equator even more. So other large-scale trends that you should note, which we explore in our chapter, are changes in phenology, so seasonal timing of life activities, like the spring phytoplankton bloom. These changes are actually disrupting predator-prey dynamics, uses of certain resources like specific fisheries. Please. So when we look across ocean and coastal ecosystems, we can see how the climate and non-climate drivers are acting on them and how ecological capacity varies. So this is one of these notorious IPCC tables, but what I want you to notice here is this middle column labeled ecological adaptive capacity. Going down that, we see low to moderate, one that's moderate to high in terms of its adaptive capacity. And it really shows that limits to ecological adaptation are really becoming apparent. So ecosystems are doing all they can to cope with the changes in systems, and they're starting to not be able to cope as well. Next slide. So one thing we did in chapter 3, which is beginning the handoff to the other speakers, is looking at the impact of climate on ecosystem services provided by the ocean. Again, look at one of these middle columns labeled observed impact, and notice that the observed impact is a combination of both the climate-induced drivers and also the non-climate drivers on the right. These observed impacts are either mixed or negative. The one service that's increasing is carbon storage, but it's important to remember that the proportion of anthropogenic carbon storage in the ocean will drop in higher greenhouse gas emission scenario. So it's not just like an unmitigated, yay, carbon storage is increasing, we're all saved. It's not that simple. Next slide, please. So when you think of ocean-based adaptations, what do you think of? Most people just think about moving fisheries or setting up protected areas. And recently the conversation has broadened to include solutions as well. But it's important to remember that the adaptation portfolio is much, much bigger than just MPAs, just moving fisheries, just nature-based solutions. In our chapter, we assess 3 groups of adaptation activities that are related to ocean and coastal ecosystems. Adaptations related to society and institutions is a pretty big pool. So these are things like enacting good governance, or making sure there's enough economic opportunity and robust social structures to withstand any changes on the social may be occurring. There's another whole area of solutions, built infrastructure and technology, or technological developments, really. These are things like early warning systems, engineered solutions, monitoring programs, breeding for, and those are where the innovation opportunities are often to be. And then finally, the third category is the use of nature-based solutions. So these are things like conservation, ecosystem restoration, using things like natural shoreline ecosystems as coastal protection. But what we really came away with is that all of these measures have to be sort of developed in coordination with other measures. There needs to be really broad inclusion of the people and groups who are going to be affected and using these adaptations. And adaptation portfolios be developed that really draw from all of these categories, so that the benefits of one adaptation can be balanced out by the benefits of another adaptation, because they're not, each one responds to a slightly different element of climate change, and sometimes there's overlap in some. So I will stop with that, and I will pass you to Helen. Helen, take it away.
Hi everyone. So next slide, please. This portion of the talk is really going to focus on climate change and adaptation options for the fisheries and aquaculture sections. And when we think about ocean and inland waters, they provide more than 3.3 billion people with at least 20% of their average intake of animal proteins. And that can go actually up to about 50% in some regions such as Bangladesh, Cambodia, Ghana, and several of the small island developing states. In addition to being important as food, these industries are also important for livelihoods, providing over 10% of the world's global livelihood contributions. Of that, about 60 million people are employed directly in the fisheries value chains. So that goes from harvesting through to distribution. And of those, 95% are in small-scale fisheries in low and middle-income countries, with almost half of them being women. When we look at aquaculture, over 20 million people globally are employed in aquaculture, where marine finfish farming is primarily conducted by the high-income countries, and inland aquaculture is primarily the small-scale producers in low and middle-income countries. When we look at this figure, you can see that capture fisheries productions has remained relatively static since the 1990s, and about 60% of the marine capture fisheries are from 10 countries only. When we look at the potential contribution of agriculture and fisheries to like regional GDPs, what we can see is they may in some areas have like low contributions, but some countries are very heavily reliant on these sectors. So that's generally several low income countries, so thinking about Africa and Pacific Island states. And currently, aquaculture now provides more fish for human consumption than wild capture fisheries, and that proportion is only scheduled to increase. When we look at globally at marine fisheries, what we see is that the proportion of fish stocks, which are at biologically unsustainable levels, has increased now to 30%. And some of that, there's medium confidence that can be partly attributed to the effects of climate change. Okay, next slide, please. So what are some of the major drivers of climate change in fishery sections? Well, as Sarah has mentioned before, you know, global warming is primarily driving these poleward migrations of fish resources. So that's leading to increased vulnerabilities for people in equatorial countries and gains further in the north and south. And this, thinking about how ocean acidification may impact some of these, it's thinking about that some of these shifts may be related to shifts in zooplankton related to ocean acidification as well. As Sarah mentioned, you know, we have these laboratory studies that are showing that there are negative effects of ocean acidification for some of the key commercial species and the life stages. So, for example, in shellfish and fish. But most of the projection models that we have for fisheries are based on temperature, and they don't often include other factors such as ocean acidification. Those that do conclude that ocean acidification increases the risk and could be a significant co-stressor, which would result in large global economic impacts. And there's more information in that. If you look at these 3.5.3, these are particular sections of the report that you can refer to if you want more information. So we have seen negative impacts for fisheries and aquaculture in regions such as the Pacific Northwest that Libel will speak to after me. And there is high agreement that some of those negative effects will occur for key specific fisheries by 2030. So we're not talking very distant timeframes, we're talking very much in the near term. So species, for example, like tanner crab, sea scallops, and Arctic fisheries. So therefore, like the inclusion of ocean acidification and those potential stressor responses into fisheries management will help increase the kind of science-informed management and accurate biomass assessments under a changing climate. There is also some evidence that organisms will become more susceptible to contaminants or disease and bioaccumulate toxins under projected ocean acidification increases. So that also has some impacts for, you know, the consumption of marine species as well. Next slide, please. So this figure kind of talks about some of the adaptation options that are available in fisheries. So as Sarah's mentioned, you know, we really kind of need this portfolio, and some of the specific options for fisheries include management technology options and some of these conservation restoration. But this particular figure shows different adaptation options from a small scale on the left-hand side through to a larger scale, and it's for marine, freshwater and terrestrial food production systems, but we'll just focus on the kind of marine fisheries here. When you look at some of the main adaptation options that can be adapted at smaller scales, some of those are related to diversification. For example, thinking about alternative livelihoods, different species that could be accessed, access to particular fisheries. So that could be through shifting fleets or gear or vessel modifications. And also some may involve economic incentives. So for example, like insurance, access to credit to be able to drive those adaptation options forward. Some of the major adaptation options for fisheries are under management. So this can be from ecosystem-based management to multi-species management, dynamic management systems that can respond quickly to extreme climatic events such as marine heat waves, and on a larger scale, promote inclusive transboundary management as well. Now, while some of these adaptation options can achieve positive outcomes, unintentional maladaptation may occur. And so, this kind of holistic response of involving everyone in the adaptation options can help reduce some of those unintentional maladaptations. So, for example, there could be cultural implications if altered species or abundances being fished, or the ability to access those resources are changed, and that has potential for human relocation as well. Overexploitation and conflicts can occur both on regional and international scales, and that can be due to unbalanced negotiations, sovereignty or climate justice issues, and also illegal fishing as well. Another thing that can lead to maladaptation too is political will or inaction, along with a lack of science-informed decision making as well. So there are a number of options that are available and kind of potential pitfalls to avoid, but there are some good adaptation options available for fisheries. So if we now turn our gaze to look at aquaculture, if we go to the next slide, we can look at the projected impact situation. And here we're going to concentrate on mariculture. So in this figure, what it's showing you is projected impacts that were assessed for species that account for 95% of the mariculture production per major FAO reporting region. So the FAO reporting regions are along the top, ranging from Africa over to North America. And just for the purposes of this talk, we'll concentrate on the OA-related impacts. So what we can see is that the projected impacts of aquaculture varied with the regional dominant culture species. So as one would expect, those with high proportions of bivalves were considered most at risk of negative effects, so those particular regions. Overall, the negative impacts of ocean acidification on bivalve aquaculture are projected to increase. And so regions or communities that are more reliant on bivalve aquaculture or shell fisheries for food or for livelihoods are considered to be most at risk. So, for example, regions in the Pacific Northwest, areas of the UK and East China as well. When we kind of look at the combined effects of increasing temperature and ocean acidification with primary productivity shifts or declines, there's projected to be a reduction in the suitable bivalve habitat globally. But when you look at the situation for marine finfish, it's likely that in the northern hemispheres where there is a lot of finfish aquaculture, there will be increases in the habitat availability in the short term until those thermal tolerances are again reached with increased warming. Another thing that should be noted too is that some regions were actually harder to assess confidently than others, and that's really related to the availability of like English language articles or articles that have actually been submitted that could be assessed. So there are lower levels of confidence in regions such as Asia, the Asia Pacific region, but over time, these assessments will become stronger and stronger as there's an ever-growing body of evidence for these things. Okay, if we can move to the next slide, please. So when we think about adaptation options for mariculture, there's a suite of different options available, and this figure is an assessment of the likelihood of implementation and effectiveness of aquaculture adaptation options alongside an assessment of maladaptation risk. So the larger circles denote higher adaptation or maladaptation, with the darker blue showing higher adaptation confidences and warmer colors showing higher confidence and maladaptation risk. So when we're considering specific adaptation options that might be related to ocean acidification, they may range from husbandry, so for example, combined food production, the use of tolerant species or strain selections, or the genetic or biotechnology selection of species. There are also on-farm approaches, so increasing and restoring biogenic habitat, aeration systems, increase infrastructure to prevent issues actually on the site, and also technological options such as early warning systems, so like GOON, for example, or site selection, which involves spatial planning. Some of the other adaptation options are kind of more generalized for climate responses. So those are related to governance, management. So for example, optimizing fisheries and aquaculture industry interactions, use of different best practice guidelines, insurance and financial support, aquaculture feeds. So that's reduced competition between food production systems and reduced GHG emission related diets. And then there's also gender equality. So for example, can aquaculture provide opportunities for addressing gender inequity or supporting food or livelihood security? So what we do see is, again, there's regional differences that highlight the differential adaptive capacities of industries. And really that's all dependent upon what their predominant culture species are too, and where they are in particular, and what their level of income is. So for example, higher income countries are more likely to do monoculture, and they have a higher likelihood of using and implementing early warning systems and overall lower risk of maladaptation, whereas other regions with lower middle income countries have moderate governance capacity to develop and implement strategic plans, yet higher maladaptation levels of financial support of access. And again, you know, there are some gaps in the literature, which leads to low confidence scores in some areas. So again, there's a growing body of knowledge that will hopefully contribute to fill in some of those gaps with more confidence. But really, like, the take-home message for both fisheries and aquaculture industries, and actually this is a theme that was running throughout all of the Working Group 2 assessments, is that with the increasing observed and the projected impacts of climate change, the adaptation options that we have available will get harder, they'll be more costly to implement, and they're going to be less effective. And that's why, you know, there's a big push towards trying to have action now so that we can really do something about this before the options get less and less for us. So I'll pass it over to Libby to talk about the regional case studies.
Great. Yeah, and I hope that I can get done in about, you know, by 10:50 or so. So if people have questions, I would encourage you to put your questions in the chat box, and maybe we can have a little back and forth before we close out the webinar. So I was a lead author on chapter 14, which is one of the regional chapters. And the focus of the regional chapters obviously was to give a regional focus, but sum up, look across all those sectors, you know, that Sarah and Helen were presenting from before, but also everything else as well. So we had a lot that we had to include in a limited amount of space. So I'll just note that overall, and I'll talk in general about kind of my assessment of what I saw in the regional chapters, because what I'm going to talk about here isn't just North America, and then actually go through them. So overall, ocean acidification was covered in some way in every regional chapter, better in some than others. And again, because we were limited in space, I think it's interesting to note today the kinds of information that actually was bubbling up in the regional chapters, because in my opinion, that's actually really important ocean acidification information and where the priorities are. So as Sarah noted, there is variability in how the pH is changing depending on where you look in the ocean. Some of the chapters actually were able, you know, kind of focused in and provided very specific information. Others tended to be kind of more general, even though everyone mentioned something about ocean acidification. I will say that I feel like the Global Ocean Acidification Observing Network, we've been very focused on scientific capacity building across the globe. And I think the work that we've done is reflected in this report, which is really exciting. Because there is more and more information being gathered, even in places where there was no information before, and that information is now available to be pulled into these assessments. And that's why our work, the GOAN work, and this work is important. So now I think I'll move. I'm trying to think if I wanted to cover anything. Okay, yeah, let's move to the next slide. So I'm going to go in order. So chapter 9, which is the first of the regional chapters, focused on Africa, obviously covering a very large geographic area with lots and lots of countries. The graphic is actually one that was in the report in the Africa chapter and represents the percent dependence on marine foods for nutrition, with obviously the darker colors being higher dependence. And this is obviously directly relevant to what Helen was just talking about. And then we also expect, you know, as ocean acidification progresses, that it may be causing greater vulnerability in the production of that food for these various countries. The coverage of ocean acidification in the chapter was not extensive. There wasn't even really one full paragraph on it, I don't think. It was noted that ocean acidification will emerge as a significant climate impact driver in all 9 regions by 2050. So again, that comes back to this, the increasing vulnerability of marine food, you know, aquaculture production in these coastal regions. Well, many of the regions, all of the countries. It also noted that ocean acidification will be a risk factor for fish and crustaceans. So, you know, not a lot of coverage, and you'll see in the other chapters that there's more, but, you know, at least it definitely was mentioned and is considered, you know, it's sort of flagged as something we need to be keeping tabs on. So for Asia, so that was chapter 10. Again, in each case, I'm trying to kind of show the geographic responsibility for each of these regions. And this obviously huge geographic region, many countries being covered. This chapter actually included very specific rates of ocean acidification for the region. In fact, they noted for along the Pacific coasts of Asia, where the waters have already experienced between a 0.01 and a 0.09 decrease in pH between 1981 and 2011. So that's an indication that, you know, pretty robust measurements are being taken. And then in terms of, you know, there's sort of variability depending on where you are. And that's the kind of information that's, you know, Sarah noted through the global network. You know, we're beginning to get this regionally specific information, and, you know, in some cases it's actually showing up in the IPCC. So that's excellent. In terms of impacts noted for marine biology, you know, obviously there are lots of coral reef regions included in this in Asia. So, you know, definitely highlighted the risk to coral reefs, talked about red corals, talked about phytoplankton, oysters, gastropods, clams, again, specific species. I didn't look at the papers that were noted. I'm guessing these are mostly based on lab studies, not an actual indication of detection of change in populations in the field. Much of the OA research is still at that stage. Talked about, you know, is OA increasing pathogen sort of virality in marine science systems? And interesting, also talked about the role of seagrasses as OA mitigation. I think this might have been the only of the regional chapters that actually noted that. And that's actually a very hot topic, and really excited to see that. In addition, there was, you know, in terms of long-term good news, there's an expectation through the research that's being done in the region that there will be some transgenerational resilience to OA in the future. And I think that's also, you know, something that a lot of research is happening on that in the field. So, or just in general. So next slide. So then we'll move to chapter 11, which is Australasia. So there was actually a lot of information. So Australasia is Australia and New Zealand, just 2 countries. They, again, like Asia, provided geographically specific OA observations and projections. Again, an indication that there's been a fair I mean, we know there's been a lot of research and also observational networks in both of the countries. In terms of impacts and risks, the obvious focus on corals, on warm water corals, but also on cold water corals as being potentially at risk. Shellfish aquaculture, oysters, specifically the black-footed abalone, a focus on marine species distributions and potential changes there. And of course, we heard a lot about that from Sarah. Not only distributions, but productivity and catch. So that comes into Helen's, what she was talking about. And then also Maori traditional seafood. So there was actually some focus on indigenous impact on indigenous cultures. There was a note that that there are some good news stories, that we think that stony corals on seamounts, because they're above where aragonite would dissolve, might be a refuge. And there's also some selective breeding that's happening in the region for oysters. So those are the sort of adaptation options for OA that were discussed in the chapter. Then moving to chapter 12, Central and South America. Not great coverage here, actually. I mean, I hate to say it, because actually I know there's a lot of research happening in the region. I'm not sure why, it wasn't covered. Obviously, they had to cover a lot of information. And frankly, I just want to note, we all were limited in what we could cover. And so we had to pick and choose. And, sometimes, even though I wanted OA to be covered more in the North American chapter, we just didn't have the space. And so we had to compromise and, make decisions as authors about what could be included. The Central and South American chapter did discuss OA, especially seafood, impacts on seafood, shrimp in Brazil. That was actually something I hadn't seen before. And then, of course, mussels and in general fisheries. So then Europe, chapter 13, they didn't include, actually in our North American chapter as well, we didn't include specific information about how OA was changing, but they did have pretty extensive coverage, which I think reflects the research that's happening in the region about the impact on calcifying, or potential impact, because again, much of this is lab study focused, on calcifying organisms, coral and algae, carbon to nitrogen ratio of organic matter, which if that's changed, affects the efficiency of the biological pump, and also food web structure, the effect on marine food, including cod, shellfish, and aquaculture. There was a note that OA impacts will be exacerbated by increasing stratification and reduced primary production, which is related again to the change in the biological pump. And finally, there was a note that work that's been done in the region is showing that deep water corals, which we noted before also for New Zealand, are showing more resilience to OA than expected, and also Mediterranean limpets. Work had been done on them, and there's some resilience there. So finally, the last slide, North American chapter, which was my chapter. Again, we would have liked more extensive coverage, but we had to compromise. So in terms of OA projections, we're saying OA is increasing along all of our coasts, but more in places affected by eutrophication, other acidifying inputs, and increasing freshwater. We actually have a pretty developed OA observing network around the US coast. I mean, not as extensive as we would like, but at least it's actually more extensive than most places. We are, again, through research, expecting impacts on squid, bivalves, including, well, actually, obviously, something happened with my parentheses there, bivalves, which include oysters, but also crabs and fish, that we expect potential alteration of food web dynamics and shellfish aquaculture. Research is showing resilience in some species too, including pollock and some of the oyster species in the US, and well, in the North America. And then we also talked about tools that are relevant for OA, including oceanographic and ecological nowcasting and forecasting tools. So this is along the lines of the adaptation that my prior author friends were talking about, integrated ecosystem assessments to inform better harvesting, and selective shellfish breeding. So that was our coverage. And then finally, small islands, which is chapter 15, which includes 57 countries. Interestingly, only authors from 5 countries were represented on the author team, but that's obviously a huge challenge. The information in the small islands chapter was pretty general, mostly rolling OA up with temperature and saying, big potential impact on coral reefs. And then their chapter, unlike any of the other chapters, actually had a whole section on research needs, which was great. And OA observation, more OA observations are needed in the region, and I definitely agree with that. And also research on impacts to species, fisheries, and the intersection of disease with both of those and its relationship to OA was included in that chapter. So yeah, I think that finishes it up, and we have like 1 minute or a few minutes maybe to answer some questions. So Gabby, I don't know how you want to handle that. Maybe we can all come back on.
Yeah, thank you for an amazing talk and covering such a wide range of material. We do have time for maybe one question. I don't see any in the chat box, but if anybody has a burning question, otherwise I can ask one. Maybe I'll give a little bit more time for somebody to ask a question and we can get through two. So
I hope we haven't blinded you with science.
So the Working Group 3 assessment was just released at the beginning of April, and you all touched on kind of how Working Group 2 built off of the first Working Group's report. So I'm just wondering if you could touch on kind of some exciting bits of OA work that you see in Working Group 3, or things that have carried over in that next report.
I can take a whack at that. Working Group 3 is really focused on mitigation opportunities. So it's not directly aligned to acidification concerns, but that report really examined we can do, what opportunities are ready now, and what are kind of proposed to really cut our emissions drastically in the near term, so that we can get ourselves onto that track of aggressive mitigation. One of the things that I did not highlight that was a clear finding of our chapter was that the lower our emissions overall, the broader the adaptation portfolio remains. So if we just, blow past all of our emissions targets and have, widespread heating and acidification, that really narrows the options we have to defend marine ecosystems against acidification and other things. So the mitigation report is really focused on sort of the human systems and the ways to change them for the good, to kind of maintain those natural resources that we all depend on.
It did also have some sections on marine carbon dioxide removal, but it was quite limited compared to the other kinds of mitigation strategies, and it was in line with the National Academy's 2021 December report. So
more research is needed.
Yeah, and the fact that we all were so enthusiastic and we filled up so much time, it's just like the IPCC reports where you're trying to get everything in.
That's right. Every word counts.
Yeah.
We do have a few more questions, but we're at the top of the hour. And I don't know if our speakers have a second to take more questions.
Let's stay on for like 5 more minutes.
Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah, me too.
So we have a question from Sophie McCoy saying, where do you see the need moving in research in ocean acidification? Should species level experiments be moving towards understanding mitigation effects or trials?
Libby, why don't you take that one?
Well, I will say that one of the areas that our NOAA Ocean Acidification Research Plan kind of highlights, and that we've been trying to think about as a program, although we don't really have a good solution for, is how to do more realistic experiments in the field to try and look at impacts of OA in the field. You know, we've done a lot of, not that we shouldn't keep doing lab experiments and keep doing field observations, but are there ways, new ways that we can think of to test systems to get kind of interactions among organisms as OA is affecting them? And there is no good way to do this. You know, there's always a downside and artifacts and you know, something why, you know, the system isn't the same as what it would be. And of course, you know, we have, anyway, I'll just leave that there, because I think for our community to percolate on, because it is an area where at least my program is interested in investing.
Yeah, it's like we know a lot, but we also know that we don't know a lot. So yeah, absolutely, those kind of areas will be good for future applications. And then you have, you know, geographical potential acclimations and everything into that. So it'll take a big effort for everyone to come together.
Great, and we have one more question for Helen. Helen, one of your figures on the fisheries, you spoke about poleward fish migrations, yet the arrows went both directions. Is that showing other species-specific responses?
Yeah, so the areas that you see with the arrows in the middle, they're the major like FAO regions. And so that's actually just, you know, like some species, their thermal tolerances, they're going to move further north, and then other species will move further south. If you can go into that figure and blow it up, you'll see that they're also related to different scales of production too. So there's like artisanal, like small scale fisheries, up to into the bigger commercial fisheries. And the interesting thing is that in general, you know, it is the poleward migrations that you're seeing. But for some regions, if you look like off the east side of Australia, they're very diverse in under the different projections where the fish species will go. So that'll be important for kind of spatial management and planning for species entrances and exits. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really impressive, the sheer amount of data and studies that go into these reports. So I really appreciate you all taking the time again to walk us through the major findings. So thank you, and thank you to our audience members for tuning in today. I posted a few links in the chat, so we'll be having our next Go On webinar on May 19th. It will focus on the Southern Asian Ocean Acidification Hub, the newest Go On hub. So as our speakers mentioned, South Asia has been kind of an understudied, or there's been a lack of data coming out of that region. So please tune in. And then for those of you not already signed up as a Go On member, there's a link in the chat to do so and stay plugged into this network. So thank you, everyone, and I will see you at the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.